Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here, hoping this finds you all safe and well. On behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, our virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums. Tonight, it is a great honor and a pleasure to have with us Nahum Dimitri Chandler, celebrating the publication of his new book titled Beyond This Narrow Now, or Delimitations of W.E.B. Du Bois. It is published by our friends over at Duke University Press. It shows that the premises of W.E.B. Du Bois's thinking at the turn of the 20th century stand as a fundamental reference for the whole itinerary of his thought. Professor Chandler deeply engages with Du Bois, demonstrating that he must be reread, appreciated, and studied anew as a philosophical writer and thinker contemporary to our time. Professor Chandler is an intellectual and scholar working broadly in philosophical problematics, especially as they concern the history of the human sciences, as well as the concepts of historicity and historical memory in general. He is professor in the School of Humanities at the University of California at Irvine. He is the author of X, The Problem of the Negro as a Problem for Thought. He is also the editor of The Problem of the Color Line at the Turn of the 20th Century, the essential early essays by W.E.B. Du Bois. Joining Professor Chandler tonight will be Judith Butler and Robert Gooding Williams. Judith Butler is a philosopher and gender theorist whose work has influenced political philosophy, ethics, and the fields of third wave feminism, queer theory, and literary theory. They are a Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California at Berkeley. They are also the Hannah Arendt Chair at the European Graduate School. Judith Butler is the author of numerous books, their most recent being The Force of Nonviolence from Verso Press. Robert Gooding Williams is the M. Moran Weston Black Alumni Council Professor of African American Studies and Professor of Philosophy and of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University, where he is the director of the Center for Race, Philosophy, and Social Justice. He is currently at work on two projects, a book on Du Bois's political aesthetics and a study of political thought of Martin Delany. Professor Gooding Williams was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2018. Before we begin tonight, I would like to remind you that we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of Beyond This Narrow Now. We will also be hosting a Q&A towards the end of the talk. So if you have any questions, comments, praise, please do post them in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. So please join us now in welcoming Professor Chandler, Professor Butler, and Professor Gooding Williams. Such a great honor to have you all with us tonight. A very warm welcome to you all. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you very, very much, Peter. It is a true honor to be hosted by City Lights Books. It goes back to when I was something in my early 20s, to my first experience of City Lights, and I've followed it since then. And this goes all the way back to the great poet Bob Kaufman, my recognition of City Lights. So it's such an honor. Thank you very much, Peter, for this invitation and support and affirmation. Likewise, I am honored and grateful to be joined by my esteemed colleagues and friends, Professor Robert Gooding Williams and Professor Judith Butler. Let me say that you all are participating in a 30th anniversary. It was 1992 at UC Berkeley that Judith Butler Judith brought Robert Gooding Williams over to me at a conference. They were at a different conference. They crashed my conference. And Judith introduced me to Robert. And he has remained a lifelong friend, intellectual traveler. So forgive me, but you all are participating in an anniversary celebration. And for me, it is of the greatest honor and magnitude. Who would have thunk it? And indeed, Judith and Robert, each in different ways, a kind of a hidden power in all of my work, the resource of intellectual friendship, affirmation, and above all, their respective examples are at stake in everything that I've been trying to do for these decades. Please allow me to open our conversation. Even before I do so, however, it is such an honor to have a number of you, some of you who are senior colleagues and examples for me as well as younger colleagues and friends tune in to this discussion. And I would particularly like to welcome Professor Lucius Outlaw, a senior Du Bois scholar and philosopher. And then a colleague, an icon who has befriended me intellectually in a way I never could have thought. And that's Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Thank you and welcome. Without further ado, I'd like to offer a brief theoretical introduction to the book Beyond This Narrow Now, or Delimitations of W.B. Du Bois, released by Duke last month. And in doing so, it is my hope that it provides a platform for you as well to engage both this discussion and with me as you like ongoing. Without further ado, first the title. The word delimitation has at least two sides of its possible meaning. First, to specify, yet also to remark that which is beyond or otherwise, perhaps illimitable. Here, this word is intended to indicate the remark, at once scholastic and interpretive, of both first, a specificity to the discourse, the general practice, and intellectual political itinerary of Du Bois, and secondly, certain aspects of his thought that point beyond the limits of both his own discourse and beyond our own limits within the contemporary intellectual conjunction. Secondly, though, in the same breath, this book is intended to elucidate certain aspects of both, one, the problematization that set Du Bois afoot, and two, his manner of engaging the questions that arose therein. The third notation I would offer is that as a practical matter in the world of scholarship today, I wish for this book, first, to enable or augment closer attention to Du Bois's discourse. Notably so as to secondly, yield a more robust and supple sense of the whole of this discourse. And I should add an asterisk here to say both the work in different ways of Professor Robert Gooding Williams and Professor Lucius Hartlaw are examples for me. Fourth, as a theoretical matter, my thought is that within Du Bois's intellectual practice, there is something that remains for us illimitable. Illimitable. Thus, it is my hope that the reader will come away from the book beyond this narrow now with more questions than answers. And that the reader will pursue those questions far beyond my discourse. Me. That would be the measure of success for this book. Likewise for me, the exemplar that I received and that has been given to me, to my intellectual generation, in this regard, is the work and practice of Hortense J. Spiller. She is, for my time, the real professor with the title W.B. Du Bois behind their name. Her thought, to my reading, opens on the horizon of the illimitable, or said otherwise, her thought opens the horizon as well as the illimitable. It points toward that which is yet without horizon in our time, otherwise than within horizon as such, guided by the exemplary figure, historical and contemporary, the question of the African American woman. To the extent that I think Du Bois ultimately as a thinker who writes, my own efforts in Beyond This Narrow Now proposes the argument that Du Bois can and should be reread in our time. The book makes this argument by three procedures. The first is a formulation of a new sense of Du Bois's thought and itinerary as a whole. The second is a clarification, as I see it, of the most essential premises of Du Bois's earliest work. For me, these essential premises follow two tracks. One is the problem of producing new collective ideals of life, ideals for social living, collective ideals. The other is the problem of a practical, theoretical engagement of practices of categorical proscription, which are at once historical and epistemological. In Du Bois, in his formulation, the problem of the color line is the signal metaphor, concept metaphor, for the problem of categorical prescription. I underline the word problem in the phrase, the problem of the color line. Two, the phrase ought to be understood as a theoretical metaphor that excludes no domain of sociality from its presence. And I wish to accentuate, as I always try to do, that it pertains tendentiously to the whole of the modern era, back to the 15th century. And likewise, its spatial reach spans the planet. Indeed, its implication ought to be understood as global in our contemporaries. Third, the way that my book makes its main argument, I'll say that again, the way in which I try to make the argument about Du Bois as a thinker-writer, the way that I do this, the manner in which I do this, is itself a kind of argument or thesis. I would accent two dimensions of my way of proceeding: scholarship and interpretation. Here's where I will dwell for just a second and conclude. My second may be your half hour, but I'll try to make it very brief. You professors have a way of wanting to talk. I'll do my best. As to scholarship in this work, I seek not to assume what is the object of study, that is the thought and practice of Du Bois. Rather, I take the position that what is involved, whatever it is that we think we are talking about when we speak the name W.B. Du Bois, or that which we think we refer to by that name, must be critically produced. By the construction of a new sense of the archive or archives that are recognized as available for study, as resource and challenge for our understanding. This is to propose that additional ways, perhaps even novel ways, of approaching the archive or archives are produced in this critical work. I can say more as it goes, should anyone find it of interest. Secondly, as to interpretation, there are two aspects here. One is textual or editorial on the one hand. I seek to propose in this book and in other books published just before it, and one coming after it, that the most exactingly close study of the text, the writing of Du Bois, must be undertaken anew. This text and other texts is the most exacting that I can muster at this time. The other aspect of my approach is interpretation. Interpretation is epistemological. At my first level of concern, I seek to recognize the forms of thought claimed, declared, articulated by Du Bois as his own most commitments: concepts, metaphors, narrative conceits, and such structures in his life. And Du Bois is notably interesting, much more so than it's often been recognized. I'll leave aside any thought or specification of this word epistemological. Thus, I approach Du Bois as an essentially philosophical thinker. Philosophical in the most general and hence most radical sense. Thinking by way of question, thinking as questions, thinking the questions, always. My approach is oriented toward making possible a new reading of Du Bois, reading Du Bois anew. Finally, let me note the status, and beyond this narrow now, of the two leading theoretical metaphors one finds in Du Bois's earliest thought: double consciousness and the problem of the color. In the first part of the book, I addressed the existential and theoretical emergence of the thought of double consciousness in Du Bois's work, a certain kind of theoretical excavation, and what Du Bois calls at times the inner development of subjectivation of the Negro American, Yet this concept metaphor encodes such a massive problematic that I hope to address it further in a work devoted to it on its own. In the second part of Beyond the Snarrow Now, I propose an elaboration of his thought of the problem of the color. I consider it of considerable theoretical pertinence for contemporary thought. In our common context of the ongoing aftermaths of official colonialism and new forms of imperial tethering in this 21st century. In essence, none of Du Bois's major works can be understood in a profound manner without a fundamental theoretical understanding of what Du Bois means by problem of the color. Let me close by saying, in an African-American tradition that I inherit from my parents, so many people are in my spirit giving this book. The late Cheryl Wall, the scholar Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, from a decade and more plus, law, the late Helen Tyler, editor and friend, the indefatigable Banning Marable, the late Lauren Ballett, who befriended me as a student, she a professor at the University of Chicago. Then to Hortense J. Spiller, exemplary for me today. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, whose work has been there for me from the beginning. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whom I first read as an undergrad, now my esteemed colleague. Who would have thunk that? Lucius Outlaw, who recognized me from the outset and responded to my initiatives. And Leslie Adelson, professor of German at Cornell. All of an older generation that has bequeathed to me much that is in this book. Of my own generation, let me call the names Fred Moten, Louis Gordon, Denise De Silva, R.A. Judy, Scott Michelson. And then in a very different way, a friend and mentor, in an utterly unique way, the late Cecil Taylor. And then singular here, from Duke Press, Ken Wissaker, editor and friend for 33 years. This book would simply not have been possible or be possible without his initiative. So let me also cite three figures that others may not recognize, for they too are present here. The late Jacques Derrida, Etienne Balibar, and as both friend and former colleague, whose hospitality toward me has been extraordinary, to whom the first part of the book is dedicated, Frederick Jameson. I hope that you find or have found this book robust, vigorous, and challenging, but above all, inviting. Thank you for listening. Robert and Judith, it is such an honor. It brings for me such gratitude that you have been willing to engage with me here in conversation about this work that has been going on for, I've been attempting for decades. So however you all would like to proceed, I would like to follow your judgment, Robert and Judith.
Robert, why don't you go first?
Okay, let me just begin by saying that, I think that the book is terrific, that your nuanced engagement with the conceptual, rhetorical, and theoretical dimensions of Du Bois's thought is, as you will appreciate, exemplary. And I especially appreciate your larger agenda, which you announced early on to enlist Du Bois in the effort to resist a certain tendency to regard, and I'm quoting you now, the problematic of matters Negro or African American or Afro-American as provincial. So that said, we won't be able to do justice to the book, this evening, and I have lots of questions and look forward to conversations beyond this evening with you. But I thought maybe a good way to begin our conversation this evening was by raising a question of method, kind of very general question. And what I have in mind is to ask you to say a bit more about your method of studying Du Bois. You touched on that a bit in your opening remarks. But in that connection, I wanted to ask you about your commitment to a distinctive critical vocabulary, central to which are the terms notation and annotation. And there are other terms as well. But in the final pages of the book, you explicitly connect notation and annotation to Paleonomy. And you suggest that your method of studying Du Bois is a form of Paleonomy, at the most general level. So my first question is just to invite you to kind of expand on that thought, because again, I think your critical vocabulary, you talked about close reading. There are lots of folks who would say, oh, I want to do close reading. And there are lots of folks who say, oh, I'm interested in interpretation. But not everyone develops those ideas, again, in terms of notation, annotation. Your next book, the one coming out in the fall, is called Annotations. Not everyone develops those ideas in terms of the terms notation, annotation, Paleonomy. Again, your, I think, rather distinctive critical vocabulary.
So let me try to be more brief than I managed to be before and say that I blame all of that on Gayatri Spivak. But the solicitation to the practice comes by way of Du Bois, notably not two central European theoretical figures, neither Foucault, Michel Foucault, nor Jacques Derrida, although Derrida's example is closer to my own approach. But the solicitation came from the work of Du Bois. There's a political weight for me, a theoretical politics, in attending to Du Bois's own production. So a notation is certainly a preparation. And a notation is the bearing of a responsibility to the solicitation. And rather than turn my attention to a theoretical debate elsewhere, or a political debate elsewhere, or a disciplinary problematic elsewhere, my concern has been to tether my work to that solicitation, and annotation is that effort. It's a name for an attempt to hear, not simply to hear declaration, but to hear questions. Questions that I may not have even known were available to be posed to me. And lastly, always, for any work that seems to me worth tarrying with, there is an inherent opacity. And that opacity is a solicitation, a challenge, and a resource, a possibility, more than it is a denial or exclusion of my inquiry. So annotation is a way of grappling with that. That's all I'll try to say now.
Nahum, I also want simply to congratulate you for a remarkable book. I learned an enormous amount from it. Unlike Robert, I'm not a Du Bois scholar, though obviously have taught him and think about him and read him. I'm struck by the fact that your book asks us to approach Du Bois patiently, and you use this word patience almost as if it is a methodology. You ask us not to rush. You say that what is important here must be approached slowly. And even today, in the way that you welcome us into this conversation, you don't rush to the point. You actually ask us to leave an everyday temporality that is to a certain extent jagged or rushed or disjointed, to enter into a more sustained reflection, staying with the language, asking what the language is saying, but also what it's doing. And at times pointing out quite persuasively that for Du Bois, writing is a form of action, and that we would be wrong, or we would be missing something quite important if we didn't understand what you identify as a performative dimension of the language. It seems to me that the language is acting in certain ways. It's also clearly described as not exactly an event of historicity, but as bearing historicity, as sedimented. And this language, it seems to me, comes a bit from perhaps Heidegger or from phenomenology more broadly. And yet there's also a sense that the historical conditions in which the color line emerges, or which require us to understand the color line as definitive, those historical conditions, which you sometimes call modernity, both give rise to a figure, Du Bois, or indeed give rise to any number of figures, Frederick Douglass, or even in Du Bois's very early work, Jefferson Davis, that these are figures, are characters, are persons who emerge from a certain historical condition, but also carry that condition in their writing, and especially Du Bois not only carries the historical condition of his emergence, we might say, in the writing, but also breaks with that condition or points to a break with that condition of emergence. So whereas one might expect you to simply contextualize Du Bois for us, when and where was he writing, what was he writing against, who was his audience, what were the ways in which he published and who read them. We could go historical or sociological, and to limit the context and go further into it. You actually, you certainly establish what many historicists would call context, but you also claim something else with this word historicity, which is that the condition continues in the person and in the language of the person, and that in the text we come up against a historicity as it is enacted, as it is lived out in language. And then further, a point which I guess I'd like you to talk about if I'm fairly reconstructing your view, and you'll tell me if I'm unfairly reconstructing your view. But if I'm fairly reconstructing your view, it seems to me that some kind of futural horizon emerges through the writing, because if we understand that the color line is not metaphysical, is not essential, is not an empirical fact of some kind that has to be accepted as such, but institutionalized or historically instituted, then we also come to understand something about the possibility of what you call desedimentation, or what we might understand as a deinstitutionalization. And the action of the writing, we might even say the activism of the writing, as you put it, seems involved in the breaking with the context, breaking with the condition of emergence. So one emerges as a certain kind of writer and can be explained in part through reference to the condition of emergence. But when that condition becomes understood as the historicity of the writing does something with it, and there's a break with context and some kind of futural possibility opens, and perhaps that also is linked to what you call freedom. So I just hand this rather inadequate reconstruction back to you to see what you can do with it if you want to sort of explain a little bit more why. Well, Bob has asked you about Paleonomy, and I'm asking you about historicity and maybe futurity, if not freedom. I'll just let you go with that.
So I was some years ago, a dozen years ago or more, at a recruitment ceremony for Japanese students in Japan. A young woman approached me from Fresno, California, and said, "I've been listening and I can't figure out your accent. Where are you from?" I said, "I was born in Bakersfield, California, 2 hours from where she was born." She could not understand my accent because it was hers. So in so many ways, when I hear you think, Judith, I learn so much, yet at the same time, it always seems to me, it's always been obvious. She just said it. So with that caveat, I want to say, I welcome most wonderfully this question. I'm going to give a twofold answer and as briefly as I can, because there is no proper way for me to hear really either of your questions, but especially the one that you just shared, Judith. I did not answer, this is the first part of my answer, to Robert's question about Paleonomy. And secondly, my response is to say, in a kind of immediate discursive context, it's not Heidegger. Rather, it is the solicitation of the African-American example across the modern epoch, and I'm using that word deliberately, for it echoes with Heidegger, to distinguish. And the way that I would mark it for us here is actually the moment, philosophically speaking, otherwise than Heidegger, the late Jacques Derrida's engagement with the problem of the historicity of ideal objects throughout the whole itinerary, but especially the late 1930s moment of the work of Edmund Husserl. At the end of his 1961 text on Husserl, Derrida affirms the manner of posing questions from Husserl, but in the same breath affirms the query, the questioning given by the work of Martin Heidegger. My own approach is to question the formation or formulation of question in Heidegger, precisely by way of the problem of the historicity of what I'm calling the African-American example. So I don't get there by way of Heidegger. I bring this question to Heidegger. And I do it on the one hand by way of Husserl, and on the other hand by way of Jacques Derrida. But neither of them, or I should say, none of those two references to Husserl and to Du Bois, I'm sorry, to Derrida, displace for me the priority of question I get from Du Bois. So I bring the question by way of Du Bois precisely to them. I take the example of the African-American spiritual, which matters so much for Du Bois. We do not know much about the literal historiographical genesis of the spiritual. Yet we know a great deal about the emergence of the problematic that the spirituals address. I would propose speculatively that they are already at stake at the time of Phyllis Wheatley. And if you recognize the order of poetry and thought of a Phyllis Wheatley, which we get in an inscription that we can inherit directly by name, I would propose that same order of historicity as we find at stake in Phyllis Wheatley is at stake already amongst African Americans. And we have to try to find a way to think that. So I come to the question rather differently than the way Husserl proposed it, with the ideality of mathematical truths, or even Immanuel Kant, contemporary with Phyllis Wheatley, and rather differently than the work of Jacques Derrida, even though I believe he's profoundly affirmative Derrida of the kinds of questions that I want to place at stake. Having said that, then, I am interested less in the question, deciding the question of the genesis of the spirit, than what they can become, their fortuity, the historicity encoded in them that makes possible another future. So that would be the order of attention that I've come to. This, for me, is exemplified in the work of Cecil Taylor. The only thing that matters about tradition is how it can help you to address the future. And once you're at stake in that way, then everything becomes available and is in play and is at stake. So indirectly, whereas I referred all of the fault of my efforts with regards to Robert's question to the older generation, let me refer my efforts with regards to your question to the younger generation. It's their fault. They must deal with this. And what I mean by that, Paleonomy for me, I get to by way of Godfrey Spivak, by way of Jacques Derrida, by way of Husserl, within the philosophical tradition. But the problematic is already there for me in Du Bois. I've referred to Cecil Taylor. And what I mean by that here, Paleonomy is the practice of the study or the study of old names or old lexemes or old markings. So in a practical sense, Robert, it's attempts to improve my technique, you know, to learn from how Bud Powell played it for Cecil Taylor, right? So he goes another way. Or to take the example of Thelonious Monk, which is what makes Cecil Taylor possible. So Paleonomy is that order of practical work. The question to me, Judith, of futurity, simply put, is precisely performative. It's always at stake. It's never given. I believe that Du Bois was a certain practitioner of writing. And I've tried to respond to that practice and the performance with measures of my own. That's the best I can do. I love the question. I took a few notes.
Yeah. Can I jump in again? So early on in your response to Judith, you referred to the example of the African American, and of course the term example is critical to your argument, to the overall argument of the book. But I wanted to ask you to say a bit more about about how you're thinking about the concept of an example. And it occurred to me that there are at least two different ways to think about that concept, both of which I think crop up at times in the book. So, and this is not unrelated to the question of historicity that Judith was posing. So sometimes we think of examples as specimens, kind of ordinary way of thinking about an example is to think about an example as a specimen of a kind. And at a certain point in the book, near the end, you actually make reference to the Negro or the African American as a kind of historical being, which might give one to believe that you're thinking of Du Bois's exemplarity in terms of the conception of an example as a specimen, which is to say that Du Bois then is a specimen of a certain kind of being, namely the Negro. But on the other hand, you early on in the book, you say things like, and I'm quoting now, I think this is page 25. You say that Du Bois's practice as a thinker, you describe it as an exemplary inhabitation of our common horizons. And this notion of inhabitation, comes back several times. Sometimes you talk about Du Bois's peculiar inhabitation of a certain historicity. So back to the theme of historicity. But it seems to me that when you say that Du Bois's example is an exemplary inhabitation of our common horizons, you're not saying really that Du Bois's inhabitation of our common horizons is a specimen of some kind. I take you rather to be suggesting that Du Bois's example is exemplary. I'm putting in mind of the way in which Nietzsche uses the concept of exemplarity in Schopenhauer's educator. I mean, the idea is not that we should think of examples or exemplars as specimens so much as models that we might emulate. So the suggestion is when you say that Du Bois's inhabitation of our common horizon is exemplary, you suggest that and I think this may be implicit in your in some of what you've already said today, in part in your response to Judith. You suggest that maybe we ought to follow Du Bois's lead. So those are two different conceptions of exemplarity: specimen, someone to emulate, someone whose lead I ought to follow. I think I can find there are moments in the text where I think you mean the one rather than the other. I think the second one is probably what you mean most of the time, but I'm not sure. I guess a third possibility, which is absolutely critical here, invited by your remarks a few moments ago about Du Bois's relation to Heidegger, that you're bringing Du Bois, to Heidegger by way of Husserl and Derrida. So here the thought is that, well, maybe Du Bois is you might say, well, I'm trying to elicit from Du Bois a revision of our conception of exemplarity. So it's not, similar, just like you're just not, as we're taking over a certain Heideggerian notion of historicity. Similarly, you might argue, well, I'm not taking over any received notion of, Nietzschean or otherwise received notion of exemplarity. I think Du Bois is revising our conception of exemplarity. So all of that is just a kind of frame of reference, so to speak, for you to say more about what you're doing when you use exemplarity, to describe Du Bois' project. And I certainly know that Du Bois himself uses the category in Dusk of Dawn, and that's absolutely critical, but I kind of wonder, what it really amounts to, and whether it's the best, once you begin talking about historicity and the inhabitation of common horizons, all of that, whether the category of exemplarity, understood in either of the ways I suggested, or some third way, is really the best way to get at what you described Du Bois as getting at.
Thank you, Robert, for this wonderful question. These questions are worth the price of the ticket, I hope you all know. Let me answer you two ways. First, yeah, all of that. The second way, for me, the lexical term and theoretical term and philosophical question of the example cannot sustain all of this order of question that we are posing. I thus try to place the term example in play, shall we say, by way of the word problem, that to which I am solicited, or that which I wish to sustain, is not a model per se in the ultimate instance, nor something that can or should be emulated as such, although I very much appreciate not only the Nietzschean reference to Schopenhauer, but your approach to that question in your own work. Likewise, throughout Derrida's career, he's very much caught up with the question of the example. But I first came to the question of example from Du Bois. So a twofold answer, referring to the two aspects you mentioned. On the one hand, you cannot avoid the matter of the specimen. That's almost the very condition of even thinking what's at stake. I'll put it in very immediate, vulgar terms. Du Bois did not have the status that he ought to have had within the institutions of both the United States and the various countries of Europe, which was granted to others of far less capability, accomplishment, and commitment. We don't even know their names. But parenthetically, so too with Phyllis Wheatley, for example, in parentheses. So there's a necessary theoretical politics to addressing the status of the specimen, shall we call it. You cannot avoid it. In fact, the integrity of one's engagement is mocked by them. There is, for me, a precise, committed theoretical practice related to that. But secondly, I do not want nor believe that anyone and everyone, certainly not myself, should simply emulate Du Bois. But the problem that's at stake in his thought, in his practice, to me, that is the order of exemplarity. I believe that an attention to how he tried to do what he does or did is an immense resource. So I don't try to emulate Du Bois per se. I don't write like Du Bois, you see. But what he has endeavored to engage is, for me, profound. And it's the very pathway by which I try to do what I do. So let me give my one quick example. Thelonious Monk, Cecil Taylor. When you hear Thelonious Monk, I like to say it's like he pulls out as much as he can and sees that the structure still stands. Cecil Taylor wants to see that structure and put as much weight, and it's not a classical symmetry, as he can to enable something else to open up. The metaphor for me in Cecil Taylor's work is dendritic. So for me, there is no example per se of Du Bois, but rather what he was tarrying with, what he was working with. It's my responsibility to try to inhabit that anew.
Yeah, right. In a new way, in a way appropriate to your own preoccupations and concerns. Okay, yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Nahum, may I want to give you a chance to address maybe two issues that will explain to the audience, an audience that may or may not have read this work, a little bit about the salience of this book at this moment. And I was particularly struck by the way that you foreground the color line as the chief problematic in the works by Du Bois that you're considering. And it's very different from studying race or looking at racialization as a process. It's very different from starting with a definition of racism. The color line seems to be key to modernity. It's reproduced. We might say it's a condition of possibility of the modern, but it's also it rips through the modern. It's a kind of tear that is there always, and it's always being reproduced, tearing again. Can you say something about how understanding the color line as having this enormous epistemic power? I don't even want to say epistemic power within modernity. It's like we can't think modernity without the color line, right? So this is an enormous claim, and it's key to so much of what you do. Can you situate that for us in terms of other approaches to, say, race and racism, to African American history, it strikes me as a disorientation from some of the contemporary frameworks that we are seeing, and also a reorientation of in a way that opens up questions of futurity, for instance, that some consider to be foreclosed. The other question I have, and I'll just throw it in, is probably most of us who are not Du Bois scholars know the concept of the veil. We know the idea of double consciousness, of split consciousness, and we associate that more with a kind of Hegelian background, maybe speculating on the influence of Josiah Royce, if that was in fact as important as some say it was. But you, in shifting, I think, to the color line, perhaps you're asking us to situate what we know about double consciousness in light of this larger epistemic issue. I may be wrong there, but if so, I think that would also shift the way that many readers approach Du Bois.
My goodness, I should have known that I was in for this when I invited this conversation. It's wonderful. Let me try to be brief in saying two thoughts here, very simply. One, the problem of the color line cannot and ought not be reduced to the problem of the concept of race. That's what you already annotated. But that's the first insistence. The second is the thought that the problem of the color line, as I understand it by way of Du Bois, is historical, not ontological. Let me now then propose two summary formulations that guide, or I attempt to use as guides for what I have to say. I'll put them in 2 words and then try to say in a paragraph. One, it's not a given thing, or at least I intended not to be thought that way. I'm hesitating because I don't want to give a formulation that would too easily be congealed, but I'm going to risk it for the sake of this conversation. It's regulative rather than constitutive, the problem of the color line, with regards to taking the example of a problem of ideas of reason, as Immanuel Kant formulates it in the first critique. The second is to generalize. Maybe I moved too quickly. I'll try to come back to the first and then come back to what I mean by generalization. If one says, there, that's the problem of the color line, and we can use it to explain modern history, we've made it constitutive. But if instead we recognize the thought of the problem of the color line as enabling us to look precisely at what is ostensibly given and recognize therein another dimension of its effectivity, of its emergence, of where it can go, that's the problem of the color line. For me, Du Bois does not, in his work, actually give us a history or an account of the epistemological formulation of the concept of race. I think that's crucial. But it can be done by way of his thought, rather than the concept of race, explaining the problem of the color line. The problem of the color line helps us to recognize the historical emergence, the theoretical bearing of the idea and the concept, and then the theorizations, according to Alexine Philosophine, that we think of, ideological reference, that we think of as the concept of race, okay? So the problem of the color line helps us to recognize that the concept of race is part and parcel of it. I could say so much more, as you could already see where I'm fussing around, but that's the first point. So it's not a given thing. It's the name of a problem for thought, and it's immensely productive. Du Bois poses this very unstable problematic early in his work, and this other book that's coming from Duke Press in the fall, Annotations, deals with Du Bois on precisely this point. That's the point, is to read him a certain way. I'm leaving a much out because I want to get to the second part, which to me is really what matters most to me right now. Double consciousness. The secret is to generalize this thought rather than parochialize it or provincialize it. I'm going to not try to say so much about that, but say that's the secret. And I'll give two annotations and conclude with this thought. One is about the problem of the color line, and the other is precisely about double consciousness. I don't want to blame everyone else for my own efforts, but Judith, you're implicated in this thought in a very wonderful way for me. I think of the problem of the color line in Du Bois's thought as a concept metaphor for forms of categorical proscription. It could be supposed differences of sex. It could be supposed differences of sexuality, of gender, of education, of citizenship, of religion, of natality. All of them are in play and at stake. And to me, the concept metaphor problem of the color line is a name given in Du Bois's discourse for that order of problem. You can have all of them at stake historically, even centuries ago, not just now. That's on the one hand. Likewise, if we do so, then to me, what the world is grappling with in this instance in the Ukraine is an articulation of the historical production of what Du Bois names tendentiously as the problem of the color. To me, you cannot read what has happened since the Second World War, which is emerging and articulating in Ukraine, without thinking by way of the kind of thing that Du Bois names. I find him immensely productive in that way. Du Bois in Color and Democracy, Colonies and Peace in 1945 says exactly what's happening right now with world institutions would happen. It would yield war. He says it directly, and he participates in the conference in San Francisco in 1945. And they basically shut him out, but it's exactly happening now. So I would generalize the thought of the problem of the color line, and I would recognize it as helping us to recognize an entire dimension of modern historicity, which we otherwise wander around and say we can't make sense of, we can't pull it all together, but it's right there. It involves slavery, it involves imperialism, it involves colonialism, so forth and so on, blah, blah, blah. The last and second point, double consciousness is not, in my reading, about race. It's about the relation to self, but construed more broadly to forms of historicity. Du Bois calls them competing ideals, American Negro. What I find persuasive is Du Bois affirms that heterogeneity in the end. And so I wouldn't say, Robert, that he's himself exemplary, but that affirmation is exemplary. And I think when we go there, we generalize the problem or the production that he calls double consciousness. And I love this. Du Bois produces right with the thought double consciousness of the thought of second sight. And second sight isn't just seeing critically, it's imagining otherwise. So I would say that ultimately, this is the value of the thought of double consciousness. I'm leaving aside, Judith, all the debates around Hegel and Royce and others and the Du Boisians. Rather, what I affirm is this sense of possibility that Du Bois refuses to give up. Even that possibility which is hurting you, called America, you know? He's still affirming something in it. Yeah, he leaves, he dies in Ghana, but he still has this sense. So if I may permit, I was going to ask several questions to you all, and I would like to transition to that right now if I can. And the reason I do is, Robert, I just said the word hope. And Judith, I just said the word hope. And I want to ask you, Judith, what do you think about Du Bois and hope? You know, he's born in the aftermath of the Civil War. He goes to the First World War. He goes to the Second World War. His country tries him for treason. And yet he's still at the end hoping. So I would like to hear your thoughts about hope and about Du Bois and hope. And Robert, I have kind of a similar question to you, but it's more specific. Du Bois, I know, has accompanied your own intellectual trajectory from the beginning. Okay, I'll leave it almost at that, but I have to make it legible for everybody else to say, I'm wondering what for you is Du Bois and hope, and what for you remains at stake for you in thinking of Du Bois.
Do you want to go first, Judith?
Okay. Well, I guess the quick answer I would give, which probably is not adequate, is simply to say that it seems that every time Du Bois identifies he delimits, to use your word, the word in your title, there's a delimitation of the horizon, of the limit of experience, of the limit of what is legible and thinkable. And then he finds a way to break through the horizon, to imagine otherwise, whether that's by traveling to Europe and looking back at the US, which he took to be, in some sense, the limit, although wanting to go to Germany as a very young person, he was establishing a perspective from which to see the instituted character of that limited horizon, and then traveling again and becoming more and more of a Pan-Africanist, somebody who believed in multilingual collaboration and solidarity, and trying to expand horizons, which I take to be expanding some sense of the possible, not in a manic way or a way that denies the brutal history of racist oppression, but actually seeks to move in it and through it and against it in a complex manner. I also think there's something about the writing that is able to exceed what it writes about, and I don't know how to describe that. You describe it as perlocutionary, and I think that it does. It never just narrates a history. It is also somehow a continuation and intervention in that history, showing us that writing and thinking of a patient and critical kind is in fact a kind of intervention. Even, I would say, claiming patience as a prerogative under duress is a way of not being defeated by it. So there's something very moving to me, both about the writing, but also about the way that travel works, both metaphorically and quite literally in his work, and his final internationalism, which I think is worth thinking about in the present day when we're seeing hyper-nationalist forms of violence and hideous destruction. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
Robert, can I follow with one quick question to Judith?
Absolutely.
Judith, maybe this is difficult for you to say directly, but I want to propose to you my own understanding and see what you think of this. Because when I read you, I'm hopeful. Always. It's always giving me that. I believe the secret is being all in. Not holding something out, you're going to invest it later, but all in here now, every instance. That's what I love about your practice in every sense. And for me, that example is just fantastic. So that would be my annotation to what you just said. I think it's a little bit like the young lady not able to know my accent because she's from Fresno and I'm from Bakersfield. You can't tell me that about Du Bois because you exemplify it. I truly think so. It's being all in.
I'm sure that's not true, but it's very kind.
That's what I think is at stake in Ukraine. That's why this gentleman has emerged with such power. Most statesmen do not go all in. They're calculating the next election. But this guy's all in. He may be gone tomorrow. And so I think that's part of what we feel across the world right now. So my apology. So Robert, what do you think about hope? Can you share?
Yeah, I'll say something about hope in a second. I just wanted to say, you just raise a question regarding your last response to Judith when you were talking about the generality of the idea of or the concept of double consciousness, and it seemed to me that that's right. I mean that I see that as being a part of your argument. But what I want to emphasize, I think, and you can tell me in a few minutes whether you think I got it right. The concept is double consciousness is not general in the way that, say, the use of a term is general or the use of a concept is general. It's as I read you, it's general in the way in which a part that illuminates the whole is general, and this is something that so it has a kind of general significance. So, and this is something that I take it, and probably we can't get into this in any detail here, but I take it that this is that last way of putting things, thinking about a part as illuminating a whole. That I take it as part of what you're getting at analytically and conceptually when you work through very, very carefully the relationship between internal dissociation and external association, and then explore what you describe as a metaleptic relationship. So that's to really kind of work that out, we'd have to kind of sit with your text and patiently, work through it, as and I agree with Judith here, as you have so patiently worked through Du Bois's text. So I just wanted that's just the kind of my annotation to your last exchange with Judith. On the question of hope, I'm not sure what I think about hope generally. I mean, it's interesting that several times in the book you I think even early on, you invoke this passage from Souls from The Passing of the Firstborn, where Du Bois speaks of a hope not hopeless, but unhopeful. In my own work, which I take it you're in part asking me about, I've been very much engaged with the theme of hope in Du Bois's writing vis-a-vis the theme of pessimism.
Mhm.
So, and my point of departure here is the chapter of Darkwater entitled "A Beauty in Death," where Du Bois associates, pessimism with cowardice, and that connection makes reference to the sunset at Montego Bay in Jamaica. So what I'm trying to think about in that connection is the way in which natural beauty for Du Bois functions as a response to a pessimism and despair, a response to kind of hopelessness vis-a-vis the possibility of undoing racial domination. So in terms of my own, you said, Du Bois has been there, from the beginning. I don't know if it's absolutely from the beginning, but in a curious way, Nietzsche was there for a long time. In a curious way, my engagement with Du Bois via the problem of pessimism has brought me back to Nietzsche and to Schopenhauer and to their thematizations of the problem of pessimism. And on the one hand, and at the same time, I'm thinking about Du Bois and what Du Bois wants to say, what Du Bois thinks about pessimism and hope. I'm thinking about Du Bois's thinking of those themes in relation to contemporary discussions, obviously in relation to contemporary discussions of Afro-pessimism.
Well, I know that we are approaching our limit, and this is so wonderful. If I may just give one thought. The possibility of beauty, the possibility of natural beauty. That's what I think Du Bois will unendingly affirm.
Yes, I agree. He's not an optimist. He rejects, interestingly, so I take it when he speaks about hope not hopeless but unhopeful, there's a rejection of a certain kind of optimism. He associates optimism with the idea that we can attain to a world where beauty is never ending, and he says no, that not in the cards. We can interrupt ugliness, right? And it's precisely because the possibility of beauty ever avails us.
Let me give a distinction. I think Du Bois is critical of sentimentality.
Yes.
More than he is critical of optimism. And if we can make that cut, I would say, when you are 6 or 7 years old and pulled from your parents' arms, endure 6 weeks of travel on an ocean you've never seen before, in the hold of a slave ship. You can see him talking about Phyllis Wheaton. When you've endured the unimaginable already at 6 or 7, then the production of that which can enable you to have hope, we have to give thanks for that. But Du Bois has an entirely other reference in addition to that. He has Wheatley, for example. He has Douglas, for example, and so forth and so on. He has all the spirituals, for example. So when he says unhopeful hope, I read that as analogous, not the same as, what we think of as a critical engagement with the conditions of possibility. But he never gives up that commitment to possibility, ever. That's what I find remarkable.
No, I don't disagree with, I don't disagree with that. Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that.
But this is a problem for us, not for him.
Yeah, right.
I love this question. Thank you very, very much. I must say, Du Bois quotes at the very end of The Souls of Black Folk in the penultimate chapter of The Coming of John. he quotes the spiritual, "You may bury me in the east," which I take as potentially an allegory for Africa, but all of these, of which Africa is just a name. But also he cites to Elizabeth Barrett Browning and to her poem, A Romance on the Ganges. And you know, she's out of an ancestry that profited out of the West Indies, out of Jamaica. And she engaged that in a certain way. And Du Bois insists on calling that reference, you see? So even in the midst of that family tradition, he goes to her and calls her forward, even out of the Romantic age, into a book, The Souls of Black Folk. And I think it's attached to Jenny, which is the sister of John.
Well, I don't know how long we can go on. I mean, yeah.
Well,
Yes, I get you. And
I'm just going to conclude.
Go ahead.
Yet the river floweth on.
Yes, right.
That's in the poem.
There's a very beautiful chapter near the end, which I wrote down, but where you talk about you're talking about Du Bois and leadership and criticizing certain ways of thinking about Du Bois's conception of leadership, and you talk about children, generations of children, and the idea that leaders engage in a kind of reciprocative rejoinder to possibilities, enacted by ancestors who are no longer there. So that I just mentioned that, and it's in that connection that you talk about Ginny, and you talk about various other figures who you read as to use Christina Sharp's term, as in the wake, in the received wake, that the received wake that the sort of leader that Du Bois imagines looks to with an eye to repeating and carrying forward the possibilities that those ancestors in the wake embodied and enacted. So that's just to say I hear you.
Judith and Robert, this for me is extraordinary. I hope that others who've been able to join find it valuable as well. And I have to say to City Lights, you've always lived up to everything that has been promised by City Lights, and thank you for this. Peter, I am happy myself to be available and at stake as long as anyone wants to, but I know that we only have so much platform according to City Lights and my esteemed guests. Can I ask those of you who are present to join me in expressing my sincere gratitude to Professor Judith Butler and Professor Robert Gooding Williams for joining in this conversation. However you can manifest your appreciation, I would like to say thank you.
And thank you.
It's our honor. It's our deep honor.
Absolutely.
So Peter, I follow you from here.
There has been so much activity in the chat, and I thank you all. Everyone's so engaged tonight, and there's so much positive energy. I don't know if we have time to take all of them. I think we could at least maybe try to tackle one or two questions. Let's see. So David says, would your guests care to comment on the reality of dignity which the economic independence pragmatically conferred by, and this is in quotes, 40 acres and a mule would convey not only to the specimen, but to each and every person? How does the reality of earth-land-based equality embodied in an actual access to the economic value of the United States land lift the, quote, veil of, quote, otherness?
That question is far excessive to what I can muster. I will just join with hearing it and then I'll try to offer a reception with a question by. It seems to me that the questioner has a thought that there is no commensurate measure, and that equality may be too limited of a concept for lexeme or philosophy to address what's at stake. And if that's so, I would affirm, but I would affirm that less as a problem than a kind of solicitation to work, a solicitation to think, to generate additional references, other frames of reference. And above all, I would accent, in English, we get the words generosity and hospitality, but I would say there are multiple traditions from across the world, and some directly in the Americas over millennia, really, that can be referenced. So I would just leave it at that. I won't try to say more.
Great. And then Rebecca comments, I am wondering if you might expound on your notion and use of, in quotes, concept metaphor as you see its importance in Du Bois. As you know, that phrase appears in my own work, but I see a certain expansion upon it in your work, a quite fruitful deepening of it as an analytic for interpreting Du Bois's lexicon as well as his method. Could you please speak to the notation of the concept metaphor and or the theoretical metaphor of Du Bois?
This is from a scholar, fellow traveler, Du Bois scholar, Professor Rebecca Rutledge Fisher of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I was going to say UNC Chapel Hill. And she is of the character of thought that if she didn't exist, I would be trying to invent it. So I don't have an answer to that question, okay? But let me just say more precisely, concept metaphor is less, again, an answer than it is a path of thinking. And for me, it is to insist, on the one hand, against those who've always read African-American writers as somehow, I'm not even sure what metaphor, but I'll just say unphilosophical, uncritical, unrigorous, unconceptual. And it's to insist against, and like some have in the past insisted with regards to American literature in general, that there's something more fundamental there that can be thought. I once heard somebody say, oh, Du Bois instinctively guessed. No, he didn't instinctively guess. He had a problematic, and he worked at it, and he conceptualized, and he theorized. So concept metaphor, to attach concept before metaphor, is to insist on that against that kind of tradition. The second part is to insist that concept, as it is given in the philosophical tradition out of Europe, based on Greek conceptuality, doesn't go the limit of what's at stake for Du Bois. There is something at stake beyond what can be given to the epistemological, what can be given to the theoretical lexeme, to the construal of a philosophical proposition. And to attend to that dimension of Du Bois's practice requires one to push at the limit. So it's working against both of them. That's for me what's at stake. But Professor Rutledge Fisher does this in her work. It's the best reading on Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, that I know.
Well, we have essentially pretty much used up most of our time here, but this has really been such a very deep and layered and stimulating discussion. And I'm hoping that in the future, we get to continue this in other forms as newer books begin to emerge. And this has been such a great gift. Thank you, all three of you, Professor Chandler, Professor Butler, Professor Gooding-Williams, also all of you in the audience for gracing our halls and you know, interjecting with those wonderful questions in the chat and also your well-wishing. So thank you all. We've posted links with which you may purchase Beyond the Narrow Now in the chat function. Also want to remind everyone, City Lights is actually open for business. We're open 7 days a week, 12 noon until 8 p.m. So please come on down, browse our stacks. We would love to see you. Tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, which continues the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, into the future through public events like this one, through our publishing program and educational outreach, all of course dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So be safe, everyone, be well. We hope to see you again very, very soon. Peace be with you.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was
Thank you,
great.
Robert.
Bye-bye, Judith. Bye-bye, Nahum.
Bye-bye. Thank you.